Let's get ready to rumble.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are in the world. We say thank you for joining us for this new podcast series from iMedics. Hosted by our founders, Dr. Mo and Dr. Sandhu, we'll be diving into the worlds of sport, technology, and healthcare, to name but a few. Episode 1 begins with a recap of the recent boxing exhibition match between Floyd Money Mayweather and his opponent, YouTube and Disney Channel reprobate Logan Paul. We'll be talking about Floyd's rise to success, along with what it takes to be an elite athlete, even after retiring. So grab yourself a fruit tea, put your feet up, and enjoy the next 30 minutes of audible nourishment.
Hi guys, it's Dr. Sandhu here, the co-founder of iMedics. I'm a GP, born and bred in the UK. I work as a GP in a city called Coventry. Been a doctor for about 9 years now, and of course been part of iMedics, which is an online medical education platform, since it was founded back in 2017. Mo, if you give us an introduction, a bit about your background, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, hi guys, my name's Dr. Mo, also one of the other co-founders of iMedics. And basically what we do is we teach doctors, so we're an online medical education organisation, and we teach about 12,000 doctors each and every year. A bit about myself, so I've been a doctor for about 10 years, specialise in family medicine, we call it general practice in the UK. And really that's a little bit about myself before we crack on into the subject for today.
Perfect, excellent, Mo. So welcome, guys. Today's podcast, we're going to talk about a recent big fight. So many of you boxing fans will have known that Floyd Money Mayweather, as he's known, made his return to the boxing ring in the early hours of Sunday morning against the YouTube sensation Logan Paul. A pay-per-view event. Very interesting. I mean, I'm a big boxing fan. Mo, are you a big boxing fan, or are you kind of a bit more casual? How would you describe yourself in terms of boxing?
So I did some boxing when I was younger. It was all amateur level. I obviously followed the sport. I know a bit about the history. I wouldn't say I'm a big fanatic, but I'm certainly got a keen eye on what goes on past, current, and hopefully future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're probably, I'm sure you would have been up to date with what happened this weekend. It was an interesting matchup, actually, for a number of reasons. Floyd Mayweather is obviously known as the best boxer, or the greatest boxer of our generation. He was unbeaten throughout his career, beating some of the big names like Manny Pacquiao, Andre Berto, Manuel Marquez, Oscar De La Hoya. He beat lots of big fighters, but obviously he's been retired in recent years, and he's 44 now. Now, obviously, if you compare that to Logan Paul, it was a really, really interesting matchup because Logan Paul is obviously not a professional boxer. He's classified as a novice, has had one professional fight, and then went straight in against Floyd Mayweather. So it was interesting to see how they would fare. Obviously, on paper, the thing that you see is you'd expect Floyd Mayweather to win quite easily, but with every story, there's always a plot twist. Mayweather's obviously 44, and he's been out of the ring for quite a long time. Logan Paul is 18 years younger, so people always talk about age and how lots of sports stars in general tend to kind of slow down and kind of ease off in terms of their skill levels as they kind of get older. So people thought, well, Logan is a lot younger. He's a bigger guy. I mean, I'm sure you would have watched. You'd see that his height, weight, and reach were all bigger than Mayweather's. But ultimately, I think it was the kind of ring knowledge that Floyd Mayweather had, which I think led him to comfortably win that fight. Did you see the fight, Mo? What were your thoughts on kind of how it went?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did see the fight, not live, but shortly after. I think there's a couple of interesting things which I want to highlight, certainly from my perspective, and we'll talk a bit about the medical side of things a bit later on as well. So Floyd Mayweather's got an interesting style of boxing, which is A, don't get hit, B, only utilise the punches that you need, so conservation of energy, and C, speed. That combination, I'm sure there's other factors as well which play a large part in what he does. But if you look at other boxers who have done very, very well. So specifically perhaps a heavyweight like Muhammad Ali, those have all been critical factors, which is speed, not getting hit, and conserving energy for the correct moment in time, which is usually towards the end or an opportune moment whenever there's a knockout. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, totally agree. So again, a bit like yourself, Emma, you obviously touched on the fact that you did some boxing. I also did a lot of boxing. In fact, I did some boxing about an hour ago. I was at the gym, did 5 rounds on the bag, 4 rounds of skipping. So boxing's something which I've always followed and I've always done as well since I was a youngster. And actually, it is a kind of art form. It's and Mayweather demonstrates it very well, which is the art of hitting and not getting hit. So I think you touched on some critical points, which is, ultimately, I mean, you need to make sure that you are not getting hurt yourself. It's a dangerous sport. You can get lots of serious injuries in terms of head injuries, but even cosmetic. You can get scars from cuts if you're constantly getting hit. And Floyd Mayweather has demonstrated how you can, really tighten up your defence. Very, very defensive fighter, excellent defensive fighter, and actually demonstrated that again on Sunday. He was able to kind of close in on Logan Paul, blocked most of his shots, moved very quickly, would throw a quick jab, a quick right hand, and then he would move out again. So he'd be in range in what they call in boxing, and then he'd be out of range again. So he'd do some damage and then move away. And he did that throughout his career, actually. So I wasn't really surprised to see him do that against Logan Paul, considering he's done this to people like Manny Pacquiao and Andre Berto and Oscar De La Hoya, the big Ricky Hatton as well. He's beat those kind of guys. So he's kind of demonstrated that all the way through his career. And I think you were right about Muhammad Ali as well. So Muhammad Ali was very similar. He liked that style of kind of hitting your opponent as quickly as you can and then moving away and making sure that your defense is really tight and you're not actually getting hurt or injured yourself. So yeah, definitely a good point raised. One thing I wanted to touch on actually was Floyd Mayweather in general, in terms of the fact that he's 44. So and his last fight was at the age of 39. Now that was interesting because most sports stars tend to go downhill, and I can think of a couple of things. So one is obviously like footballers, for example, the average retirement age is 35. You've got 2 exceptions of players who are doing really well in their kind of mid-30s. That's Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. But the majority of top-level players will start to kind of wean down their careers in their early 30s. Then they may move to a smaller club before eventually just stopping. This week I read about Mo Farah, who missed the Olympic time for the 10,000 meters, I think it was, that he was running, which was interesting because if you roll the clock back, obviously he's a gold medalist, so he's been the best in the world for many years, and he's now showing signs of kind of slowing down, and he was easily beaten by another athlete. So what are your thoughts on that? So I mean, Mayweather seems to demonstrate nicely that he's still got the know-how up there. Obviously, Logan Paul isn't. I wouldn't call him, an Oscar De La Hoya or a Manny Pacquiao or even a Canelo, somebody like that. But still, Floyd was able to demonstrate that against a much younger and bigger opponent.
Yeah, there's another footballer who comes to mind, Ibrahimovic, who's relatively older and he's continued to play at a relatively high level, which is interesting because you're right, a lot of footballers around the age of 30, they start to decline quite quickly and then obviously they move down the league or perhaps they do other stuff. So a couple of things I think that have cropped up, a few points that you've mentioned. I think the first thing is that longevity in the sport. How do you achieve longevity? And probably one of the key things is don't get hit. I mean, if you're aware of some of from the medicine that we've done previously in terms of head injuries, concussions, that's probably going to significantly decrease your career span as a boxer. So don't get hit will probably prolong your career. And Floyd Mayweather obviously demonstrates that excellently. Other things, probably diet. Diet's very important. And then environment, so stuff like obviously staying fit. Because what I've heard about Floyd Mayweather is he is pretty much year-round in shape, and he'd be pretty much ready to go into a fight at any point in time during the year. I'm not sure if that's a case of his diet, his exercise regimen, his genetics, but whenever he speaks to reporters, that was one thing reporters always mention, is that he's pretty much ready to fight anytime. Now, obviously, that might have changed since he's retired, and certainly it was the case when he was professional and not retired, that he was pretty much good to go. So I think those are the two or three key components. And then certainly genetics. I think genetics plays a massive part. If you look at Floyd Mayweather's father, he looked still very young if you go back, let's say, a decade or so. And there must be something in genetics. And the reason I give that analogy is because, there's a lot of people out there who want to build muscles and get stronger and bodybuild or lift weights and look good. It makes sense. And then you get protein shakes and you have to consume lots of protein. You have to work out, let's say, 7 times a week. You have to bench press 150 kgs. But if you look at the animal kingdom, let's take an elephant. An elephant's got a lot of muscle mass, is incredibly strong, but probably has never benched or done any exercise in its life, like weight-based exercise. And it's vegetarian. It's a vegetarian animal. It eats grass and leaves. So that goes to show that actually genetics forms a large part of strength, resilience, longevity, and that's probably something that we don't currently, from a medical perspective, we can't control. Maybe in the future with like gene technology and some of the biotech companies that are coming up across the world, you'll be able to modify some of those genetic factors to make you stronger, more athletic, and perhaps even live longer. But we're not at that stage yet. And I know we're going slightly off topic. I'm trying to bring like a medical slant to this, but effectively, that's my input on some of the things that you touched on, Vika. So I don't know if you want to take it from there. We can bounce to a different topic, or we can kind of delve into that topic a bit more.
Yeah, no, I think there is a valid point there, which is diet and genetics is the one that you've touched on, so I won't go into too much detail. Obviously, some people will have, for example, more fast twitch muscle fibers genetically, and therefore they're going to be good sprinters or good at kind of explosive sports, whereas some people, like say Mo Farah, may have a more genetic tendency to the slow twitch muscle fibers. So from a physiology point of view, they're more programmed for endurance based activities like 10,000 meters, 5,000 meters, whereas a 100-meter sprint is going to be very difficult for them. And Floyd Mayweather is like a lot of top level athletes. So I'll put him in the bracket of Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi. You touched on Ibrahimovic. There's not many stars who kind of keep performing at a high level in the latter end of their careers. And I think you've touched on genetics, but diet, as you said, is a crucial thing. And it's interesting because there are lots of people, lots of fighters that I've seen over the years. Ricky Hatton comes to mind, who would be in really, really good shape, come fight time, six pack, chiseled, looking really good, but in between fights they would let themselves go, and whether that was diet, whether it was drink, and obviously not exercising and not training properly. Whereas the highest elite level performers, Floyd Mayweather, Ronaldo, etc., these guys, like you touched on, Mo, they're always in shape. They don't think, okay, the fight's done now, let me just let go and eat what I want for a few months and then I'll get back into training. These guys are like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the intensity, so I'm not going to train as hard as I did in the fight camp. And I will obviously peel off, but I'll still do a nice jog. I'll still do some skipping, some light bag work, some light weight training. So they're constantly in shape. And I think that then gives them that longevity, that ability to carry on performing. Not many people manage to do this, and it's a good learning point. If there's any sort of budding young athletes that are listening to this, if you're a budding footballer or a runner or a boxer or cricketer or whatever it may be, there's a really, really big learning point in that. Is that if you want to prolong your career and be successful, you have to have that mindset of kind of constantly feeling like not just letting go. You obviously need to have time off. You will go on holiday, you will take some time off, you might obviously eat a bit of junk food, but it shouldn't be a prolonged period of time where you're doing that. So it might be fighting, you're in camp for a couple of months, you've had the fight, you might then eat what you want for a week or two, but after that get back in the zone again, even if it's light training, to make sure you're constantly fit and healthy. And there's lots of fighters, lots of sports stars that have done that and demonstrated that really well. But it does lead me on to the next topic, actually, which is mindset as well. So obviously when we talk about medicine, whether you're preparing for exams, and we talk about sport, we often talk about the mental side of things, and I think you have to be very clued up in your brain when it comes to sport and performing at a high level. Some of the things we've touched on, like diet and exercise, but it's the kind of IQ. So Floyd Mayweather's always been spoken about as a fighter with a high boxing IQ. Tyson Fury is another one. These kind of guys. Muhammad Ali was another one. The way they think about the boxing, and Mayweather's interesting because he kind of. It's interesting to kind of follow his career because he's literally beaten everybody, all of the big fighters of the generations that were there during his time. And one of the things that the boxing analysts often say is that he starts very slow, and he did the same thing against Logan Paul. He starts slow, doesn't really do much for 1 or 2 rounds, and you look at him and think, what people are talking, why do they say Mayweather's the best? And you think, I don't think he even won that round. But what you seem to see with Floyd Mayweather is within those kind of first couple of rounds, he's just working out what is his opponent doing, how's he moving, what's his footwork like, how many shots does he throw. Once he's worked that out, the fight changes dramatically. And what we saw against Logan Paul, which was an exhibition, once Mayweather had figured out what Logan Paul was doing, he pretty much took the whole fight, was completely in control. His footwork was great. He dominated the pace, and dare I say, he probably could have ended the fight as well if he wanted to. But I think and Logan Paul looks very tired as well from kind of round 3, round 4 onwards. So I think there's a good mindset that some of these athletes have at the highest level, which probably comes from the fact that they've been boxing or doing their sport from a very, very young age, and they've been committed to doing that from a very young age. Thoughts on that, Mo?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you just look at the stats, Floyd Mayweather, he threw 107 punches, as opposed to Logan Paul, who threw 217 punches. So 100% more punches almost were thrown by Logan Paul. Of the 107 that Floyd Mayweather threw, 43 landed. So that's 40% of his punches connecting. Whereas with Logan Paul, only 28 punches landed out 217, which is 13%. So if you think of this as a computer game where each player has a fixed energy reserve and you're draining all that energy reserve with each punch, Logan Paul has effectively drained himself quite quickly early on with the punches. He hasn't connected, which means he hasn't done any damage to his opponent, i.e. he's not made him tired or for example, unsteady on his feet. And then this leaves Floyd Mayweather to come in and pick apart Logan Paul, which I know didn't go to a knockout, and maybe if the matches went on for 20, 30 rounds, which they sometimes used to back in the 1900s, you would see a different outcome to the fight. But it was really, really interesting. And then the other thing, Vikas, which you touched on a bit earlier, was the diet part of things. So Floyd Mayweather has his own chef round the clock, and he can order at any point in time a meal, and the meal's prepped to a very high spec, in a sense that it's fresh ingredients, it's high quality, it's probably going to be organic, and it contains a lot of vital nutrients, and it's not something the average person or even an amateur athlete probably has access to. So the level of conditioning, the level of diet, the level of attention to detail that goes into how Floyd Mayweather would have trained is world apart from perhaps someone who's an amateur level. And then the other thing you have to appreciate is, you and me are doctors, and perhaps, you've got podcast listeners who are engineers, mathematicians, teachers, warehouse workers. We spend our lives working, and then we come home and rest, and we have family time. But you have to appreciate professional boxers or professional athletes spend their entire day pretty much resting, training, eating, and it's repeating that process, and obviously preparing for the fights in this case. So the level at which they're able to do that and sustain that, and then obviously execute on that in a ring environment, is just beyond belief. So when you're looking at these boxers running around in the ring, you think, oh yeah, I could do that. But actually standing 3 rounds in a ring with another fighter throwing punches and blocking punches is extremely difficult in terms of the energy requirements that you need to put in. And I don't know what your thoughts on that are. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there's something else to think about when you think about that is actually the boxing under lights. So in a professional boxing arena, you've got these high spec lights, which are obviously there for television coverage, and you've got thousands of people. Now, when there's thousands of people in a room, naturally, think about yourself in a meeting. If there's lots of people in the room, generates heat, feels warm. You want to open the windows or turn the fan on or what have you. And so this is something which is very difficult for professionals and obviously for amateurs as well to mimic, because boxers will do lots of sparring. In the gym, there's obviously going to be people there, but there's not going to be thousands of people, and you're not going to have those television lights and stadium lights overhead. So I think you do have to account for that, and that's why if you look at boxing training in general, there's a lot of focus on endurance. So it's not a case of, I know lots of heavyweights will lift heavy weights and things, but if you look at, and certainly from my time, and I don't know what it was like when you were boxing, but one of the key things that boxers do is running. And they do long distance running. So we used to do kind of a 3-mile run as part of our pre-season training in the amateur boxing camp in the gym. And boxers do that, and often they wake up very early in the morning. I think Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, those kind of guys, they always used to talk about waking up in the early hours of the morning when your opponent's asleep and going on a really 2.5 mile, 3-mile run. And they do endurance work, obviously with the bag work and the kind of conditioning circuit things like squat thrusts, dorsal raise, burpees, star jumps, those kind of things that people do, skipping as well, to really build up that endurance and try and get yourself in as best shape as you can. And ultimately, you can't mimic the fight night, but there is something else that boxers do actually, which again long distance athletes do, which is training at altitude, which is really, really an interesting point to think about. So now we can't all manage to do this. You kind of go to a high altitude where there's less oxygen. That stimulates your body to produce more red cells, because it has to work harder for you to get the oxygen into your body. And then when you come back to normal level, you've got more red cells, and therefore they've got more capacity to carry hemoglobin, and therefore your fitness is a lot better. So some of the boxers, I think they train in the Big Bear Mountains in California. And it's certainly something which a lot of long distance runners do. I've been at altitude, so I've summited Mount Kilimanjaro in 2017, which is the largest freestanding mountain in the world. They call it the rooftop of Africa. And when you're at that altitude, gosh, it really there's no air at all. Like any small step you take, you get breathless. So I trained myself by preparing for that trek by doing long distance running. So I did a couple of half marathons, which is about 13 miles. One was in Birmingham, one was in Rugby. But I did read at the time that you can buy these altitude masks. I didn't try them. I thought it'd look a bit weird if I'm running down the street with this big oxygen chamber thing. You'd probably get scared of me as I'm running through the park. But there's certainly things that people try. I'm not sure how good they are. We'll probably have to look into that, and probably that'll be a topic for you and me, Mo, at some point. But how good they are at mimicking kind of that feeling of lack of oxygen. But that's another interesting side of things, and that's what the key aspect of kind of getting yourself in shape, so that on fight night you can just try to kind of mimic as much as you can, but naturally you'll never be able to mimic the actual feeling of all that heat. And like you said, someone who's in there to try and get you out of there, if that makes sense. 36 minutes you've got to go through, and it is very difficult. And obviously it's a ring, isn't it? So you can't run away. You can move around, but moving around takes away energy as well, which is kind of why Floyd Mayweather is so good, because, as you said, you gave us some really good stats there. He didn't waste his punches. If me and you were in there, maybe we'd just be throwing shots left, right, and centre, missing half the time, getting tired, and then you're going to lose the fight anyway. So, but that was my little sixpence piece on that topic.
Okay, great. So what we'll do, let's put a medical slant on this. We'll cover 2 or 3 topics. One is hydration. Number 2 is the gloves, and then number 3, concussions, which is like not effectively knockouts. So let's start off with the gloves first. So I don't know if you know this, but the gloves have different weights. So you have 10-pound gloves, 8-pound gloves. And in this fight with Floyd Mayweather and Paul Rogan, you had 10-pound gloves.
So basically the 10-ounce gloves, So they're basically ounces. So you have for sparring they use like 12 or I think even 14 ounces. I think I've got some 12-ounce gloves. They're quite big and chunky, and obviously sparring, although it's very tough, you don't want to get injured during sparring. Your trainers are not going to, they don't want you to get cuts and stuff. So the heavier gloves are kind of used for your training purposes, whereas the boxing level, 10-ounce gloves are really kind of tight and zippy, and they've got a real snaz to them, and they're very light, so you can throw your shots with a lot more venom. And I suppose you're less likely to get tired, right? The heavier the gloves, if you've got a heavy weight on your hand and you're throwing punches, it's more likely to kind of tire you out. So I think the reason they went for the lower ounce in this fight was because there wasn't going to be any scorecard. So the only thing they allowed for this exhibition was a knockout, which is kind of why Mayweather and they both agreed, well, like, okay, let's go for a 10-ounce and see if we can get a knockout. But I think in terms of safety, it's a difficult one, because obviously if you get hit by a big padded glove, that will have obviously repercussions. But on the same side, if you get hit with a lighter glove but a faster shot, that will also have repercussions. Because that leads on to your second topic, which was concussion, wasn't it? So, we often, one of the big things that you worry about in boxing is two things, really. So one is the constant kind of, getting hit in the head, and you're constantly heads jolting back and forth throughout the fight. And the second is obviously a really big shot that actually knocks you out. And we've seen that, throughout the sport. And that can be very tricky. Obviously, boxing does have, the professional levels, and even amateur does have a ringside doctor and ringside medics. And you would have seen at the end of this fight as well, the doctors get in, they ask a few questions, they shine the torch to look at the pupils to react, because obviously they're looking to make sure there's no kind of bleed in the brain or impaired brain function. So they're always going to, shine the light in the eye, and they'll probably do another medical as well when they go back to the changing room. So it's certainly an interesting one, and obviously, I don't know what your thoughts are actually on those couple of topics.
Yeah, so the lighter the glove, the increased risk of injury.
Yeah, not surprised.
So, the heavier gloves have more padding on them, which effectively makes it less likely that cause serious injury to another fighter. So in this case, obviously, apologies, it was ounces, not pounds. So 10 pounds would have been 5 kgs per glove. So that was like an obvious mistake. But essentially, the heavier the glove, generally speaking, the safer it is. And then coming on to hydration, I think, which was the second thing. You're right, you do get dehydrated quite quickly, and the fighters were able to work through that and still maintain their performance or their level of, freshness perhaps, or energy levels that they would have when they're not dehydrated. Is probably very, very important. And then the last thing is concussion. So it's interesting in terms of the physiology. What's that knockout punch? So knockout punch is when the brain inside essentially hits the skull from the inside very quickly and then bounces back off and hits the back of the skull essentially. And that is what results in a knockout of someone. So they get knocked out, they become unconscious. And in order for that to happen, the head has to snap backwards and forwards quite quickly. So you hit a punch, it could be on the chin, it could be a direct jab, and the head will snap backwards, but the brain will actually hit the front part of the skull, and then it bounces off that, and that results in a concussion. It's a safety mechanism, we think, which must have been developed at some point in the physiology of human beings. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, VCAS, very, very briefly, was Mike Tyson mentioned this, which is a small person or a small fighter can knock out a much bigger man, depending on the quality of the punch he's able to land. I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a good point. So because people often assume that a smaller person won't be able to kind of, generate enough power to hit a bigger person. But I think Mike Tyson is correct, actually, because if you look at some of the lighter weights, the lightweights, flyweights, featherweights, and Floyd Mayweather started off at a lighter weight as well. If they connect properly on the chin or even across the temple, for example, they will knock people out, and that's a given, because they generate speed, and that speed causes this kind of explosive power, which people kind of don't assume that a smaller person has. So, and Floyd Mayweather demonstrates that, he's got a good explosive shot. Manny Pacquiao was another one. Amir Khan, Prince Nassim Hamid, people that we've seen over the years that are lighter weight fighters, but they can generate explosive power. So it's the execution of the punch, right? So as long as you know how to throw the punch and you connect in the right place, you can still knock somebody out. It's not a case of, it's not like those movies that we used to see, where the small guy or the small girl is hitting the bigger guy or bigger girl. And they're just not moving, because that doesn't happen. Like if you genuinely do connect in the right places with an explosive shot, even if you're smaller, you can still generate enough power.
Yeah, touching on that, Vika, so it's the physics behind it is force equal mass time acceleration. So even though your mass may be small, i.e. a smaller fighter, if the acceleration's higher, the force overall becomes higher. Obviously, the optimal scenario is you have a large mass, heavyweights, and a very quick acceleration. So force equal mass time acceleration, which means a much greater force. And in the stats here, so Logan Paul was actually 6'2", 188 centimeters, as opposed to Floyd Mayweather, who was 173 centimeters. So that's 5'8". And Logan Paul weighed 190 pounds, whereas Floyd Mayweather weighed 147 pounds, so almost 30 pounds difference between the two. So in theory, if you're a regular person on the street, you're thinking, yep, Logan Paul's going to go in. You don't know anything about boxing. The big dude's going to go in and knock out the little dude, and it's the end of the story. And actually, that's not what happened here, for a number of different reasons, but one of the reasons that we've just discussed. So Vikas, let's try and bring this to a close then. I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on then before we wrap this up.
No, I think so. It was an interesting fight. So obviously, it was just interesting to see how Floyd Mayweather would do after time out of the ring, aged 44, against someone who's a lot younger, a lot fresher, a lot bigger, and who would, on paper, would appear to be a lot stronger. But I think a couple of learning points really were that I think you don't lose that IQ. The kind of boxing IQ that Floyd Mayweather's had throughout his entire career. He's clearly not lost it, even though, he's older than he was when he last fought. The second thing, a couple of things we touched on, but staying in shape. So, the importance of regular exercise, good nutrition, good hydration, very, very important for prolonging an athlete's career. And in terms of the general population, it's very important to prolong our own health and our own lifespan. We want to make sure that we stay healthy. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure you do train. The current UK guidelines currently say we should be doing sort of half an hour, 5 times a week where we're feeling breathless. That could be a jog, it could be a fast walk, it could be weight training, it could be anything. Pick your sport: tennis, badminton, rugby, whatever it may be. So that's the second take-home message, really. And like I said, the third thing is the diet. So making sure that you've got good nutrition, good balanced diet, really. Good mix of carbohydrates if you're going to do like a long-distance endurance event. Good protein to repair the muscle mass and the breakdown of the muscles that you've had and allow them to repair. And of course, you need fat as well. We're not saying you can't have fatty stuff, but that needs to be in moderation. It needs to be a smaller portion of your diet, and obviously complementing that with good fluid intake. And by fluid, not just lots of tea and coffee, which is what a lot of people do now, but rather good glasses of water throughout the, at least 6 to 7 glasses of water, and then you can have some tea and coffee in between as your kind of additional drink. So that's my kind of take home messages. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Mo, before we wrap up.
No, I think we'll leave it there. We look forward to you guys joining us for our next podcast. And of course, you can subscribe to our podcast channel. So we'll see you soon.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you all once again for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. And if you want to hear more, then please like and subscribe, along with following us on all of the social medias to keep up to date with all this juicy content. Thank you.